In the unforgiving Wyoming Territory of 1875, Ezra Thornfield stood nearly 7 feet tall and cast shadows that made grown men step aside. Yet no woman had ever looked at him with anything but fear, until a fierce schoolteacher from Philadelphia saw something everyone else had missed. When Constance Whitley discovered the gentle giant secretly nursing wounded sparrows back to health with hands that could crush stone, she realized that sometimes the most tender hearts beat inside the most intimidating frames. But would their forbidden love survive a town determined to tear them apart? Thunder's hooves pounded against the hard ground as Ezra Thornfield rode across the endless grass fields of Wyoming Territory. The summer of 1875 burned hot and dry, making sweat drip down his face under his wide hat. At nearly 7 feet tall, Ezra looked like a giant sitting on his golden horse, his huge shoulders blocking out the sun behind him. "Get those cattle moving!" shouted Buck Wheeler, the ranch boss from across the field. His voice carried on the wind, but Ezra heard something else too, whispers from the other cowboys working nearby. "That man ain't natural," muttered Pete Garrison, a young cowboy with freckles covering his sunburned face. "Nobody should be that big. Makes me nervous just looking at him." "Heard he once broke a man's arm just by shaking hands," added Charlie Ross, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Ranch owner only keeps him around 'cause he can do the work of 3 men. Ezra pretended not to hear them, but every word hit him like a punch to the gut. He had heard these same whispers for years, in every town, at every ranch where he had worked. Being different wasn't his choice, but it was his burden to carry. The cattle moved slowly in the heat, their brown and black bodies creating dust clouds that made everyone cough. Ezra guided Thunder with gentle touches, never using his spurs or raising his voice. Unlike the other cowboys who yelled and cracked whips, Ezra found that animals responded better to kindness. "Easy there, girl," he whispered to a stubborn cow that had wandered away from the group. His deep voice was so quiet that only the cow could hear him. She looked up at him with big brown eyes and slowly walked back to join the others. The morning dragged on as the sun climbed higher in the bright blue sky. Ezra's shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and his throat felt dry as sand. He reached for his water bottle, taking small sips to make it last. The other cowboys always made sure to stay far away from him during breaks, leaving him to eat and rest alone. "Thornfield!" Buck Wheeler rode over on his gray horse, his weathered face serious under his hat. "Need you to check the fence line down by Willow Creek. Some of the posts looked loose yesterday." "Yes, sir," Ezra replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He had learned long ago that speaking softly made people less afraid of him, though it didn't always work. As he rode toward the creek, Ezra noticed something moving in the tall grass beside the path. Thunder slowed down without being asked, as if the horse sensed something important. Ezra climbed down from his saddle and walked carefully toward the movement. A small brown rabbit lay on its side, breathing hard and fast. Its back leg was twisted at an odd angle, probably hurt by a predator, or maybe stepped on by cattle. Most cowboys would have put the animal out of its misery with a quick shot, but Ezra knelt down in the dirt instead. "What happened to you, little one?" he asked softly, his huge hands hovering over the tiny creature. The rabbit's eyes were wide with fear, but it was too hurt to run away. Ezra looked around to make sure no one could see him. The other cowboys already thought he was strange. They didn't need to know about his secret habit of helping injured animals. Carefully, he scooped up the rabbit in his massive hands, holding it as gently as he would hold a soap bubble. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I know a safe place where you can heal." He carried the rabbit to a hidden spot near the creek where thick willow trees created shade and privacy. Over the months, Ezra had built small wooden boxes here, lined with soft grass and hidden from view. This was his secret place, where he brought hurt animals that others would ignore or kill. The rabbit's breathing slowed as Ezra placed it in one of the boxes. He had learned to make tiny splints from twigs and strips of cloth torn from old shirts. His fingers, thick as sausages, worked with surprising skill as he carefully straightened the broken leg and wrapped it tight. "There," he said when he finished. "Give it a few weeks and you'll be hopping around good as new." As he stood up, brushing dirt from his knees, Ezra heard the sound of wagon wheels on the main road that led to town. He stayed hidden behind the trees, but peeked through the branches to see who was coming. A covered wagon approached, pulled by two tired-looking horses. The driver was a woman with reddish-brown hair that caught the sunlight like fire. She sat up straight despite the bumpy road, her small hands gripping the reins with confidence. Ezra had seen plenty of women come through Cedar Ridge over the years, wives of settlers, daughters of ranchers, ladies passing through on their way to California. But something about this one was different. She didn't look around nervously like most Eastern women did when they first saw the Wild Territory. Instead, she seemed to be studying everything with sharp, intelligent eyes. The wagon passed by without stopping, heading toward town. Ezra watched until it disappeared behind a hill, wondering who she was and why she had come to this harsh place where most women feared to travel alone. Thunder whinnied softly, reminding his master that there was still work to do. Ezra gave the rabbit one last look, making sure it was comfortable in its makeshift bed. Then he climbed back onto his horse and rode toward the fence line that needed fixing. But as he worked under the hot sun, replacing broken posts and tightening loose wire, his mind kept drifting back to the woman in the wagon. Something told him that her arrival would change things in Cedar Ridge, though he had no way of knowing that by evening, his carefully ordered world would begin to shift in ways he never could have imagined. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Ezra finally finished his work and headed back toward the ranch. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the chimneys in town, and he wondered if the mysterious woman had found whatever she was looking for in this dusty corner of Wyoming Territory. The next morning brought news that spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire in dry grass. Ezra heard it first from Pete Garrison, who could never keep quiet about anything interesting that happened in their small town. "New schoolteacher arrived yesterday," Pete announced as the cowboys gathered around the chuck wagon for breakfast. "Miss Constance Whitley, all the way from Philadelphia. Town council finally found someone willing to come out here and teach our young ones." Charlie Ross nearly choked on his coffee. "Philadelphia? What's an Eastern lady want with our dusty old town?" "Same thing they all want," laughed another cowboy named Jake Martinez. "Adventure and romance. Until they see what frontier life is really like. Give her 2 weeks before she's begging to go home." Ezra ate his beans and hardtack in silence, but his heart began beating faster. The woman in the wagon, she must be the new teacher. He had wondered why she looked so determined, so ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "She's staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house until the school committee can fix up the teacher's cabin," Pete continued, always eager to share gossip. "Heard she's got more books than the general store, and speaks French too." "French?" Jake shook his head in amazement. "What use is French out here? Can it rope a steer or brand a calf?" The cowboys all laughed, but Ezra didn't join in. He had always wished he could speak other languages, could read the books that educated people talked about. Being large and strong had its advantages on a ranch, but sometimes he dreamed of having a quick mind instead of just quick hands. After breakfast, Buck Wheeler assigned the men their daily tasks. "Thornfield, I want you to take a load of supplies into town today. Henderson's store needs feed for the chickens, and Doc Miller ordered some medicine from Denver that came in on yesterday's stage." Ezra's stomach flipped like a fish in a bucket. Going to town meant facing stares and whispers, meant watching people cross the street to avoid him. But it also meant he might catch another glimpse of the new teacher, the woman who had captured his curiosity. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly, already dreading the trip. Thunder seemed to sense his master's nervousness as they rode toward town, pulling a wagon loaded with supplies. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, and he snorted softly, as if asking what was wrong. "It's nothing, boy," Ezra murmured, patting Thunder's golden neck. "Just another day of being the town monster." Cedar Ridge wasn't much to look at. A main street lined with wooden buildings, A few side streets with houses and shops, and dust everywhere. But to Ezra, it felt like walking into a circus where he was the main attraction. People stopped their conversations to stare. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. Even the dogs seemed nervous when he passed by. Ezra made his deliveries quickly, wanting to get back to the ranch as soon as possible. But as he loaded empty crates into his wagon, he heard a commotion coming from the direction of the schoolhouse. "You can't expect children to learn in a place like this," a woman's voice rang out, clear and angry. "Half the roof is missing, there are no desks, and I'm fairly certain something has been using the corner as a bathroom." Ezra found himself walking toward the sound, curious despite his better judgment. Behind the school building, he saw the new teacher facing off against 3 members of the town council. Her green eyes blazed with fury, and her hands were planted firmly on her hips. "Now, Miss Whitley," said Mayor Patterson, a fat man who always looked uncomfortable in his tight suits. "We know the building needs some work, but—" "Some work?" Miss Whitley interrupted. "Mr. Patterson, this building needs to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. I wouldn't keep pigs in a place like this, much less expect children to spend their days here." Ezra had never heard a woman talk so boldly to men in positions of power. In his experience, ladies were usually quiet and polite, especially when dealing with town officials. But this small woman showed no fear at all. "The town council has limited funds," explained Councilman Roberts, a thin man with a scraggly beard. "Perhaps if you could make do for now, we could make improvements over time." "Make do?" Miss Whitley's voice rose higher. "Education is the foundation of civilization, gentlemen. If you want your children to grow up ignorant and backward, by all means keep making excuses. But if you want them to have any hope of success in this changing world, you'll find a way to provide them with proper facilities." Ezra found himself nodding in agreement. He had never had much formal education himself, but he had always regretted it. Books were magical things that could transport a person anywhere, teach them anything. Every child deserved that chance. The argument continued for several more minutes before the councilman finally walked away, muttering about difficult Eastern women and unreasonable expectations. Miss Whitley stood alone in front of the broken-down school, her shoulders sagging with disappointment. Without thinking, Ezra stepped out from behind the wagon where he had been listening. The movement caught her attention, and she turned to face him. For a moment, they stood looking at each other across the dusty yard. Up close, she was even smaller than he had thought, probably not much over 5 feet tall. Her reddish-brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and freckles dotted her nose like tiny stars. But it was her eyes that held his attention. They were the brightest green he had ever seen, intelligent and fierce and completely unafraid. "You're quite large, aren't you?" she said matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. Most people either ran away or stared rudely when they first saw him. Her calm acceptance caught him completely off guard. "Yes, ma'am," he managed to say. "I'm Ezra Thornfield. I work out at the Broken Arrow Ranch." "Constance Whitley," she replied, walking closer. She had to tilt her head back to look at his face, but she didn't seem intimidated. "I suppose you heard my discussion with the town council?" "Yes, ma'am. They should give you what you need. Education is important." She studied his face carefully, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You believe that? Most men around here seem to think book learning is a waste of time." "Books can take you places your feet never could," Ezra said quietly. "Teach you things you never would have learned otherwise. Every child should have that chance." A slow smile spread across Miss Whitley's face. "Mr. Thornfield, I think you and I are going to get along just fine." As she walked away toward the boarding house, Ezra stood frozen in place. No woman had ever smiled at him like that before, like he was a normal man worth talking to. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. Thunder whinnied impatiently, reminding him that they needed to get back to the ranch. But as Ezra climbed onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins, he couldn't stop thinking about green eyes and a warm smile that had made him feel, for just a moment, like he might be more than just the town giant. The ride back to the Broken Arrow seemed longer than usual, filled with questions he didn't dare ask himself and possibilities he didn't dare imagine. Thunder's hooves pounded against the creek bank as Ezra guided his horse through the morning mist, but what he saw by the water made him pull back hard on the reins. A small figure knelt beside the rushing stream, her auburn hair catching the early sunlight like fire. Miss Constance Whitley had her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and she was trying to catch something in the shallow water with her bare hands. "Easy there, little fellow," she whispered, her voice gentle as spring rain. Ezra dismounted quietly, his massive boots making no sound on the soft earth. He had learned long ago how to move without frightening creatures, both animal and human. As he crept closer, he could see what had captured the schoolteacher's attention. A young beaver kit, no bigger than a house cat, struggling weakly in the current. "He's hurt," Constance said without turning around. Ezra wondered how she had known he was there. "His back leg looks twisted, and he can't swim properly." The giant cowboy felt his heart do something strange in his chest. Most folks would have left the creature to its fate, but this tiny woman from the big city was risking her Sunday dress to save it. He stepped into the creek without a word, his long arms reaching easily to where the kit struggled. "Let me," he said softly. Constance looked up at him with those green eyes that seemed to see right through a person. "You won't hurt him?" Something in her tone made Ezra pause. Not fear of him hurting her, fear of him hurting the beaver. It was the first time anyone had worried about his gentleness toward something else, rather than his danger toward them. "No, ma'am," he promised. "I won't hurt him." With movements as careful as a surgeon's, Ezra scooped the kit from the water. The little creature didn't struggle in his enormous hands, somehow sensing safety rather than threat. Ezra examined the twisted leg with the concentration of a man who had done this many times before. "Broken," he said quietly, "but clean. It'll heal if we set it right." "We?" Constance asked, surprise clear in her voice. Ezra felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I mean, if you wanted. I know a bit about fixing broken things." What he didn't tell her was that he had been fixing broken things since he was 12 years old. Not just animals, though there had been plenty of those. Broken fence posts that other cowboys had given up on. Broken harnesses that the ranch had planned to throw away. Broken spirits sometimes, though those were harder to mend, and folks rarely noticed when they healed. Constance studied his face with the same intensity she probably used when teaching arithmetic to her students. "Show me," she said simply. They walked together to a shaded spot beneath a towering cottonwood. Ezra pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket. His mother had taught him to always carry one, back when she was alive, and began tearing it into strips. His massive fingers worked with surprising delicacy, creating tiny splints from willow branches. "Where did you learn to do this?" Constance asked, watching him work. "My ma?" Ezra replied, not looking up from his careful task. "She said every creature deserves a chance to heal, no matter how small or broken it might seem." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Ezra's voice grew quiet. "Died when I was 16. Fever took her that winter." Constance placed her small hand on his arm, and Ezra nearly dropped the beaver kit in surprise. No one had touched him voluntarily in years, not since he had accidentally crushed old Mr. Peterson's fingers in what was meant to be a friendly handshake. "I'm sorry," she said. "It must have been hard losing her so young. She made me promise something before she passed," Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Made me swear I'd never let my size make me forget how to be gentle. Said the world had enough rough men, and maybe God made me big so I could protect small things instead of breaking them." The beaver kit chirped softly as Ezra finished wrapping its leg. The splint was so tiny it looked like a child's toy in his enormous hands, but it was perfectly crafted, straight and secure, without being too tight. "Your mother was right," Constance said. "The world does need more protectors." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the kit rest in Ezra's cupped palms. Finally, Constance spoke again. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Thornfield?" Ezra nodded, though his stomach tightened with nervousness. "Why do you hide this part of yourself? This gentleness?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He stared down at the small creature in his hands, feeling the familiar shame rise in his chest. "Folks don't expect gentleness from someone like me," he said finally. "They see the size first, and that's all they ever see. Cowboys think it makes me soft. Ladies think it makes me strange. What do you think it makes you?" Ezra looked up at her then, really looked. Her green eyes held no judgment, no pity, just honest curiosity. When had anyone last asked what he thought about anything? "My ma used to say it made me human," he admitted. "But sometimes I wonder if she was just being kind." Constance was quiet for a long moment, her fingers trailing in the creek water. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that surprised him. "In Philadelphia, I knew men who attended the finest schools and wore the most expensive clothes. They could quote poetry and discuss philosophy, but they would step over a dying dog in the street without breaking their stride." She looked directly at him. "Yet here you are, a cowboy in the wilderness, crafting tiny splints for creatures most people would consider pests. Which man would you rather be?" Before Ezra could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. 3 riders appeared through the trees, Dale Hutchinson and 2 of his friends from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Their faces carried the particular mix of curiosity and trouble that Ezra had learned to recognize and fear. "Well, well," Dale called out as he dismounted. "Look what we have here. The giant and the schoolmarm, playing house by the creek." Ezra felt his body tense automatically, every muscle preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. But Constance surprised him by standing smoothly and facing the men with the same calm confidence she had shown when examining the injured beaver. "Good morning, Mr. Hutchinson," she said pleasantly. "Lovely day for a ride, isn't it?" Dale's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Ezra still sitting with the beaver kid in his hands, Constance's rolled-up sleeves and damp dress hem, the intimacy of their shared task. "Mighty cozy setup you got here," Dale said with a nasty grin. "But I'm wondering if the good folks of Cedar Ridge know their schoolteacher spends her free time consorting with certain types." The word consorting dripped with implication, and Ezra felt rage begin to build in his chest. But before he could respond, Constance stepped forward. "Mr. Hutchinson," she said, her voice crisp as winter air, "if you have concerns about my conduct, I suggest you address them with the school board. Otherwise, Mr. Thornfield and I have work to finish here." Dale's face flushed red at the dismissal. "Work? What kind of work involves a giant and a lady getting all friendly? By a creek? The kind that saves lives," Ezra said quietly, finally finding his voice. He stood slowly, the beaver kit still cradled carefully in one enormous palm. This little one was drowning. Miss Whitley was trying to help him. "A beaver?" Dale laughed harshly. "You're telling me the schoolmarm got her dress dirty over a damned beaver?" "Every life has value, Mr. Hutchinson," Constance said firmly. "Perhaps that's a lesson you missed in your own schooling." The insult hit its mark, and Dale's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. Ezra saw the motion and felt everything inside him go cold, and still the same deadly calm that had gotten him in trouble as a younger man. But it was Constance who diffused the moment, stepping between them with her chin raised and her green eyes blazing. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying all the authority of a woman who had faced down roomfuls of unruly children, "I believe you were just leaving." For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Dale spat in the dust and remounted his horse. "This ain't over," he said, looking directly at Ezra. "Not by a long shot." As the 3 men rode away, Ezra realized he was shaking not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of having someone stand up for him. Constance turned back to him, and he saw something in her expression that made his heart skip. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "I should be asking you that," Ezra replied. "You just faced down 3 armed men. "I've faced worse than Dale Hutchinson," she said with a small smile. "Besides, I had backup." She gestured to the beaver kit, still resting peacefully in Ezra's hands, and despite everything that had just happened, he found himself smiling too. But as they walked back toward town together, both knew that something had shifted in the space of that morning, something that would change everything that came after, whether they were ready for it or not. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Ezra found himself standing outside the one-room schoolhouse, a cloth-wrapped bundle in his massive hands and uncertainty written across his weathered face. He had been awake since 3 o'clock, pacing his small cabin like a caged bear, trying to decide if what he planned to do was brave or foolish. Inside the bundle was something he had never shown to another living soul, a collection of small wooden carvings he had whittled during the long, lonely evenings. Animals mostly, horses, birds, even a tiny beaver that looked remarkably like the kit they had saved together. His mother had taught him to carve when he was small, back when his hands were still growing into their enormous size. It was the only artistic thing about him, and he had kept it secret for 15 years. The schoolhouse door opened, and Constance emerged carrying a water bucket. She wore a simple brown dress with her hair pulled back in a practical bun. But something about the way the morning light caught her profile made Ezra's chest tighten in a way that was becoming familiar. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, genuine pleasure evident in her voice. "You're up early." "I wanted to. That is, I thought you might." Ezra stumbled over his words like a schoolboy, feeling heat creep up his neck. "I brought you something." Constance set down her bucket and waited patiently while he unwrapped the bundle with painstaking care. When she saw the carvings, her green eyes widened in amazement. "You made these?" she whispered, picking up a perfectly carved mockingbird with wings that seemed ready to take flight. "They ain't much," Ezra said quickly. "Just something to pass the time." "Not much?" Constance turned the bird over in her hands, marveling at the intricate detail of each tiny feather. "This is extraordinary work. The detail, the precision. You could sell these in any city back east." Ezra shook his head firmly. "They're not for selling. They're for—" He paused, gathering courage. "They're for teaching, if you want them." Understanding dawned on Constance's face. "You want to donate them to the school? Children learn better when they can touch things," Ezra explained, his words coming faster now as excitement overcame nervousness. "My ma used to say, hands teach the mind better than books sometimes. Thought maybe your students could use them for counting, or learning about animals, or just for the joy of holding something beautiful." Constance finished softly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking down at the collection of carved creatures. Finally, Constance looked up at him with an expression that made Ezra's heart do strange things. "Would you like to see how they work in the classroom?" she asked. "I mean, would you like to help me teach today?" Ezra's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of being in a room full of children who would stare and whisper and maybe run away, filled him with familiar dread. But the hope in Constance's voice made him nod before he could change his mind. "I'd like that," he said quietly. An hour later, Ezra found himself folded into a chair that was far too small for his frame, surrounded by 12 children whose ages ranged from 6 to 14. He had expected fear, staring, maybe even tears. Instead, he found curiosity. "Are you really 7 feet tall?" asked Tommy Morrison, a gap-toothed boy of about 8. 6 feet 8 inches, Ezra replied carefully. "Can you touch the ceiling?" This from Sally Chen, whose father ran the general store. Ezra glanced at Constance, who nodded encouragingly. He stood slowly and reached up, his fingertips brushing the wooden beams above. "Wow," breathed little Mary Patterson. "You're like a tree, a gentle tree," Constance added, giving Ezra a smile that made him feel 10 feet tall instead of merely 6 feet 8. "Mr. Thornfield has brought us some very special gifts to help with our learning." She began distributing the carvings, and Ezra watched in amazement as the children's faces lit up with genuine delight. They handled the wooden animals with care, asking questions about each creature and listening intently, as Ezra found himself explaining animal habits and behaviors. "The rabbit's ears are so big because they need to hear predators coming," he explained to Jimmy Wells, who was examining a carved cottontail with intense concentration. "What about the beaver?" Sally asked, holding up the tiny carved kit. "Why is his tail so flat?" "For swimming and slapping the water to warn other beavers of danger," Ezra replied, then added quietly, "and for building dams to protect their families." "Like how you protected that real beaver yesterday," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "My pa heard you and Miss Whitley saved one by the creek." Ezra felt his cheeks burn, but Constance stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Thornfield knows a great deal about caring for injured animals," she said. "Perhaps he could tell us about that." For the next hour, Ezra found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, tales of raccoons with broken paws, birds with torn wings, and even a young wolf that had wandered into camp with a thorn in its foot. The children listened with rapt attention, and gradually Ezra began to relax. "Why do you help them?" asked Sarah Williams, the oldest student at 14. "Most folks would just leave them be." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Every living thing wants to survive," he said finally. "Sometimes they just need a little help to remember how strong they really are." Constance caught his eye and smiled, and Ezra realized she understood that he wasn't just talking about animals. The morning passed quickly, with Constance weaving the wooden carvings into lessons about counting, geography, and natural science. Ezra found himself actively helping lifting children so they could see maps on the high blackboard, reaching books from tall shelves, and even leading a discussion about animal habitats that had the students asking questions faster than he could answer them. "Mr. Thornfield," little Mary said during their brief recess, "are you going to come back tomorrow?" Ezra looked to Constance uncertainly. "Mr. Thornfield is a very busy man," Constance said diplomatically, "but perhaps he could visit us again sometime." "Please?" Sally added her voice to Mary's. "You know more about animals than anybody." "More than books, even," Tommy agreed solemnly. As the children filed back inside for the afternoon lessons, Ezra lingered on the schoolhouse steps with Constance. The morning had been unlike anything he had ever experienced. Acceptance, usefulness, even something approaching belonging. "They liked you," Constance observed. "They're good kids," Ezra replied. "You're a fine teacher, Miss Whitley. They're lucky to have you." "We're lucky to have you too," she said softly. "What you did in there. You have a gift with children. They trust you." "Don't know why they should," Ezra said, his voice heavy with old shame. "Most adults sure don't." Constance turned to face him fully, her green eyes serious. "Children see things adults miss," she said. "They see kindness instead of size, gentleness instead of strength. Maybe that's because they haven't learned to be afraid of what they don't understand. Or maybe they just don't know any better yet," Ezra replied bitterly. "Or maybe," Constance said firmly, "they know exactly what they're seeing." Before Ezra could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But these weren't children returning from recess. These were adult riders, moving fast and with purpose. Buck Wheeler appeared first, his face grim beneath his weathered hat. Behind him rode 3 other men from the ranch, all wearing expressions that made Ezra's stomach clench with familiar dread. "Ezra," Buck called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk." The tone in his foreman's voice told Ezra everything he needed to know. This wasn't a social visit or a work assignment. This was trouble, the kind that had been building since yesterday's encounter by the creek. "What's this about, Buck?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Dale Hutchinson paid a visit to Mr. Crawley this morning," Buck replied, referring to the ranch owner. "Filled his ears with some interesting stories about you, consorting with the schoolmarm." The word hit Ezra like a physical blow, and he saw Constance stiffen beside him. "Mr. Wheeler," she said coldly, "if you have something to say about my conduct, I suggest you say it directly." No disrespect intended, ma'am, Buck replied, though his eyes remained fixed on Ezra. But Mr. Crawley's concerned about the reputation of men who work for him. Can't have cowboys causing complications in town. What kind of complications? Ezra asked, though his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. The kind that makes respectable folks uncomfortable, Buck said bluntly. The kind that makes parents worry about their children's schoolteacher. The kind that makes a man unemployable. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ezra felt the familiar walls closing in around him, the same walls that had defined his entire adult life. Too big, too different, too much trouble for decent folks to tolerate. But then Constance stepped forward, her small frame radiating defiance. "Mr. Wheeler," she said, her voice crisp with authority, "Mr. Thornfield has just spent the morning helping me teach 12 children about natural science, mathematics, and the importance of caring for all living creatures. If that's the kind of complication that concerns your employer, perhaps the problem isn't with Mr. Thornfield's character." Buck's face reddened at the implied criticism. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you ain't from around here. You don't understand how things work in Wyoming Territory. Some boundaries ain't meant to be crossed." "And what boundaries are those exactly?" Constance demanded. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Ezra saw Buck struggle with how to answer without saying what they all knew he meant. That some people were meant to stay separate, that mixing outside your kind brought nothing but trouble. Finally, Buck turned back to Ezra. "You got until tonight to decide, Monument. Keep your job and stay away from complications. Or find yourself a new line of work." As the men rode away, leaving dust and ultimatums in their wake, Ezra felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. But when he looked at Constance, standing straight and proud beside him, despite the threat to her own reputation, he realized that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth fighting for, even if the battle seemed impossible to win. Constance woke up to screaming. The harsh cries came from outside her small cabin behind the schoolhouse, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife through cloth. She grabbed her shawl and rushed to the window, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Orange flames danced in the distance, near the creek where Ezra kept his animal hospital. Her heart dropped, like a stone, in deep water. Someone had set fire to his healing shed, the place where he worked magic with broken wings and hurt paws. She ran outside without shoes, her nightgown catching on brambles as she pushed through the brush. The smell of smoke filled her nose, making her eyes water. When she reached the creek, Ezra was already there, throwing bucket after bucket of water on the burning wood. "Ezra!" she called out. But he couldn't hear her over the crackling flames and his own desperate efforts to save what he could. By the time the fire died, nothing remained but black ash and twisted metal. The wooden boxes where he kept recovering animals sat empty and charred. The little bottles of medicine he had mixed from herbs lay shattered in the dirt. Ezra fell to his knees beside the ruins, his massive shoulders shaking. Constance had never seen him cry, but tears ran down his soot-covered cheeks like rain on a dirty window. "All of them," he whispered. "The fox kit was almost ready to go back to the wild. The baby owl just started flying yesterday." Constance knelt beside him, not caring that the ash stained her white nightgown gray. "We'll rebuild it," she said firmly. "Every box, every bottle. We'll make it better than before." But Ezra shook his head. "This wasn't an accident, Constance. Someone did this on purpose. Someone who knows exactly how to hurt me the most." The next morning brought worse news. Buck Wheeler found them at the creek, his face grim as winter storms. "Ezra, I need to talk to you," he said, removing his hat like he was at a funeral. "The ranch owner heard about the trouble in town," Buck continued, his voice heavy with regret. "He says a man who causes problems might not be worth keeping around, no matter how good he is with cattle." Constance felt her stomach twist. "They're trying to force us apart by taking away our jobs," she said, anger making her voice shake. Buck nodded sadly. "That's about the size of it, miss. Some folks in town have been talking. saying maybe the school needs a different kind of teacher, one who doesn't spend her time with. He gestured helplessly at Ezra. With what? Constance demanded, her green eyes flashing. With a good man who cares for injured animals? With someone who's never hurt another person in his life? Now, miss, you know I don't see it that way, Buck said quickly. But I'm just one voice against many. That afternoon, 3 parents came to the schoolhouse to collect their children. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, spoke for all of them. Nothing personal, Miss Whitley, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. But we can't have our young ones learning from someone who associates with, well, with dangerous types. Dangerous? Constance couldn't believe her ears. Mr. Thornfield has never threatened anyone. A man that size doesn't need to threaten, replied Mr. Carson the blacksmith. His very presence is threat enough. What kind of example does it set for our children? After they left, Constance sat alone in her empty classroom, staring at the wooden desks arranged in neat rows. She had come west to escape the narrow thinking of Philadelphia society, only to find the same small minds wearing different clothes. That evening, she found Ezra sitting by the creek, holding a small wooden carving in his enormous hands. It was a sparrow, perfectly detailed despite being no larger than his thumb. I made this for you, he said quietly, not looking up. Before all this trouble started. Constance took the tiny bird, marveling at the delicate work. Every feather was carved with incredible care, every line smooth and perfect. It's beautiful, she whispered. Maybe I should just leave, Ezra said, his voice barely louder than the water flowing over stones. Head north to Montana Territory. Start fresh, where nobody knows me. And let them win? Constance asked sharply. Let them drive away a good man just because they're too scared to see past his size? Ezra finally looked at her, his brown eyes full of pain. What choice do I have? I can't ask you to give up everything for me. Your job, your reputation, your future. It's not fair. Fair? Constance laughed, but there was no humor in it. Was it fair when they burned your animal hospital? Was it fair when parents pulled their children from my school because I chose to befriend a decent man? She stood up, pacing along the creek bank like a caged wildcat. In Philadelphia, I watched strong women become weak because society told them to. I watched brilliant minds waste away because it wasn't proper for ladies to think too hard. I came here to be free, Ezra. Free to choose my own path, my own friends, my own life. Even if that choice brings you nothing but trouble? Constance stopped pacing and looked directly at him. Especially then, the wooden sparrow felt warm in her palm, like it carried some of Ezra's gentle spirit within its carved wings. She thought about the real sparrows he had healed, how he spoke to them in soft voices while setting their broken bones with hands that could bend iron. They want us to believe we're wrong, she said slowly. That there's something shameful about kindness, something dangerous about being different. But I've seen your heart, Ezra Thornfield. I've watched you work miracles with creatures no one else would bother to save. If they can't see your worth, that's their loss, not ours. As the sun set over the Wyoming Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, both Ezra and Constance understood that their troubles were far from over. But for the first time since the fire, hope flickered between them like the first star appearing in the darkening sky. The Saturday night dance at Carson's Hall was supposed to be Cedar Ridge's monthly celebration, but Ezra felt like he was walking into a trap. The wooden building buzzed with conversations that died the moment he appeared in the doorway, his freshly combed hair still damp and his best shirt stretched tight across his broad chest. You don't have to do this, Constance had told him earlier that evening as she taught him basic dance steps behind the schoolhouse. We could stay home, read books by the fire. But Ezra was tired of hiding, tired of letting fear make his choices. If we're going to live in this town, he had replied, we need to show them we belong here too. Now, standing in the entrance with fiddle music washing over him like water over rocks, he wondered if courage was just another word for foolishness. Constance appeared at his elbow, wearing a blue dress that matched her determined eyes. "Ready?" she asked, offering her arm. Together they walked into the hall, heads high despite the stares that followed their every step. Some folks looked curious, others uncomfortable, but a few faces showed outright hostility. The music stopped as they approached the dance floor. Conversations faded like echoes in a canyon. Even the children stopped their games to watch the giant cowboy and the schoolteacher from back east. "Play something lively, Joe," Constance called to the fiddle player, her voice carrying across the silent room. "The night is young, and so are we." Joe Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's husband, looked nervous, but started a simple waltz. Other couples began to dance, giving Ezra and Constance a wide circle of empty floor. "Just follow my lead," Constance whispered as she placed her small hand in his massive one. "And remember, you're more graceful than you think." They began to move, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Ezra's size meant he had to be conscious of every step, every turn, which made him naturally careful and surprisingly smooth. His boots, polished to a shine for the occasion, barely whispered across the wooden floor. For a few precious minutes, the rest of the world faded away. There was only the music, the warmth of Constance's hand in his, and the gentle pressure of her fingers guiding him through the steps they had practiced. Some of the older women began to nod approvingly. "Look how gentle he is with her," one whispered to another. Not a single misstep. But not everyone was impressed. Dale Hutchinson stood near the punch bowl with 3 of his friends, all of them drinking something stronger than the sweet cider being served to families. Dale owned a small spread north of town and had been trying to court Constance since she arrived, with no success. "This is disgusting," Dale muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "A freak show, right here in our community hall." His friends laughed and nodded, emboldened by whiskey and jealousy. They had all watched Constance choose the giant over any of the eligible bachelors in town, and their pride stung like a fresh wound. As the waltz ended, couples clapped politely and prepared for the next dance. But Dale had other plans. He stepped forward, swaying slightly, his face red with drink and anger. "That's enough," he announced, his voice cutting through the applause like a rusty knife. "Decent folks shouldn't have to watch this circus act." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt dangerous. Constance stepped protectively in front of Ezra, though she barely reached his chest. "Mr. Hutchinson," she said firmly, "you're being rude." "Rude?" Dale laughed harshly. "I'm being honest. Look at him, towering over everyone like some kind of monster. What's next, Miss Whitley? Are you going to dance with the town bear?" Several people gasped at the insult. Even those who felt uncomfortable about Ezra recognized that Dale had crossed a line. Ezra felt the familiar darkness rising inside him, the same rage that had broken furniture and frightened people when he was younger. His hands clenched into fists that could shatter jawbones with a single punch. But then he felt Constance's small hand touch his arm, steady and warm. "He's not worth it," she whispered. And somehow her quiet words carried more power than Dale's loud insults. "Listen to your woman, giant," Dale taunted, encouraged by the attention. "Though I can't figure what she sees in a man who has to dig a ditch just to kiss her goodnight." Laughter rippled through the crowd, mean and sharp. Some people looked ashamed of their amusement, but they laughed anyway. That's when something inside Ezra changed. Not into rage, but into a deeper understanding of who he truly was. He stepped around Constance, his full height making him tower over Dale like a mountain over a hill. But his voice, when he spoke, was calm as deep water. "You're right about one thing," Ezra said, his words carrying easily through the hushed room. "I am different. I am larger than most men, stronger than most, and I have to be more careful with delicate things than you'll ever need to be." He paused, looking around the room at faces that had judged him for years. "But if you think that makes me less of a man, or Miss Whitley less of a lady for seeing my worth, then you understand neither strength nor grace." Dale's face turned purple with embarrassment and fury. "You don't belong here, freak! None of us want you!" "That may be true," Ezra replied quietly, "but wanting and deserving are different things entirely." He turned to Constance and offered his arm with dignity that would have impressed kings. "Miss Whitley, shall we continue our evening elsewhere?" As they walked toward the door, heads high and steps steady, the room remained frozen in stunned silence. But outside, under the vast canopy of Wyoming stars, both understood they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The real fight for their future was just beginning. The schoolhouse door slammed shut with a bang that echoed across Cedar Ridge like thunder. Constance pressed her back against the wooden planks, her heart pounding as angry voices drifted from the town meeting hall just 50 yards away. Through the window, she could see lantern light flickering as the entire town council debated her fate. "She's corrupting our children with her wild ideas," shouted Mayor Crawford's voice above the others. "Dancing with that giant freak in front of decent families." Constance's hands shook as she gathered the few personal belongings scattered across her desk. 3 days had passed since the dance hall confrontation, and the town's anger had grown like wildfire. Parents pulled their children from her classes. The general store refused to sell her supplies. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had been kind before, now crossed the street to avoid her. A soft knock interrupted her packing. "Miss Whitley?" came a small voice. "It's me, Lucy." Constance opened the door to find 8-year-old Lucy Henderson holding a crumpled paper flower made from newspaper. The little girl's eyes were red from crying. "Mama says I can't come to school anymore," Lucy whispered. "She says you're a bad lady now, but you taught me to read, and that can't be bad, can it?" Kneeling down to Lucy's level, Constance felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Learning is never bad, sweetheart. Promise me you'll keep reading, no matter what anyone says." Lucy nodded and pressed the paper flower into Constance's palm, before running back into the darkness. The simple gift hit harder than all the town's harsh words combined. Meanwhile, across town at the Broken Arrow Ranch, Ezra sat on his bunk, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. The handwriting belonged to his sister Martha in Kansas, the only family member who still wrote to him after all these years. "Dear Ezra," the letter began, "I heard about your troubles from a traveling merchant. The whole family is talking. Uncle Henry says you should come home and work his farm. Says maybe it's time you stopped pretending to be something you're not." Ezra crumpled the letter and tossed it into the corner. Even his own family thought he was foolish for believing someone could love him. Buck Wheeler had already delivered the ranch owner's message. "Pack your things and be gone by week's end." A sudden commotion outside made him look up. Through the bunkhouse window, he saw torches moving in the distance, heading toward the creek, where he and Constance often met. His blood turned cold as he realized what was happening. The mob had grown to nearly 20 men, led by Dale Hutchinson and fueled by whiskey and righteous anger. They carried shovels and axes, intent on destroying the last traces of Ezra's animal sanctuary. "Time that giant learned his place," Dale slurred to his companions. "Can't have him thinking he's good enough for decent women." They smashed the remaining wooden boxes Ezra had rebuilt after the last attack. They trampled the medicinal herbs he'd carefully replanted. They even cut down the willow tree where he'd carved a small heart with his and Constance's initials, something he'd done in secret, never intending for anyone to see it. But Ezra had seen it coming. Hidden in the tall grass near the water's edge, he watched them destroy everything he'd built. The physical damage hurt, but what cut deeper was the realization that nowhere in Wyoming Territory would ever truly be home for someone like him. When the mob finally left, laughing and congratulating themselves, Ezra emerged from his hiding spot. In the moonlight, the creek looked like a battlefield. Years of patient work lay in ruins around his feet. "I'm sorry you had to see that," came a soft voice behind him. He turned to find Constance, standing at the edge of the clearing, her teacher's satchel slung over her shoulder. Even in the dim light, he could see the determination in her green eyes. "They voted," she said simply. "I'm no longer welcome to teach their children, but that's not why I came." She walked to where the willow tree had stood, and knelt beside its broken trunk. Her fingers traced the carved heart that was now split down the middle. "I found something today," she continued, pulling a folded newspaper from her bag. "An advertisement in the Montana Territorial Herald. They're starting a new settlement near Yellowstone Lake. They need teachers, ranchers, people willing to work hard and build something from nothing." Ezra stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. "Constance, you can't be serious. After what they did to you here, why would you want to go somewhere even more wild and unknown?" She stood and faced him, her chin raised with the same defiance he'd fallen in love with. "Because here, we're trying to fit into their world. There, we could build our own." The idea hung between them like morning mist, beautiful but fragile. Ezra had spent so many years believing he was too big, too different, too much for any normal life. But looking at this remarkable woman who had chosen to stand beside him despite everything, he began to wonder if maybe the problem wasn't him. Maybe the problem was trying to squeeze himself into spaces too small for what he could become. "It would mean starting over completely," he said slowly. "No money, no guarantees, nothing but hope and hard work." "I've been thinking about that," Constance replied, pulling another paper from her satchel. "I wrote to my aunt in Philadelphia. She never approved of me becoming a teacher instead of finding a husband, but she agreed to send my inheritance early. It's not much, but it's enough for supplies and travel." Ezra felt something shift inside his chest. Not the familiar weight of loneliness, but something lighter and more dangerous. Hope. "What about your reputation, your career, everything you worked for?" Constance looked around at the destruction surrounding them, then back at his face. "My reputation was built on other people's approval. My career was teaching other people's children other people's ideas. But with you, Ezra Thornfield, I could build something that's actually mine." The creek continued its gentle murmuring, indifferent to human struggles and dreams. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate. And standing in the ruins of his old life, Ezra finally understood that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop trying to prove you belong somewhere and start creating the place where you do. "When would we leave?" he asked quietly. Her smile could have lit up the entire Wyoming Territory. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. The supply wagon leaves Cedar Ridge at dawn, heading north. We could catch a ride as far as the territorial border." As they stood together, planning their escape into the unknown, neither could have predicted that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. But for the first time since childhood, Ezra Thornfield felt like he was moving towards something instead of running away from it. The question that would keep them both awake that night wasn't whether they were making the right choice, but whether they were brave enough to see it through. Morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Constance stood beside the loaded supply wagon as the first pale light crept across the Montana horizon, her few possessions packed into a single trunk that looked pitifully small for an entire life's beginning. The settlement of New Haven spread before them like a promise, written in rough timber and ambitious dreams. "Well, I'll be," muttered wagon driver Tom Sullivan, scratching his grizzled beard as he studied the crude map drawn on birch bark. "According to this, we're supposed to meet the settlement leader at that big pine tree yonder. Name of Catherine Mackenzie. Came out here from Scotland with her 3 sons and a head full of ideas about building something better." Ezra helped Constance down from the wagon, his large hands steady and sure despite the nervous energy crackling between them. 3 months of travel had changed them both. His shoulders seemed broader, more confident, while her eyes held a new kind of fire that spoke of bridges burned and futures seized. "You sure about this, miss?" Tom asked, genuine concern creasing his weathered face. "This territory's got more bears than people, and winter comes early this far north." Before Constance could answer, a woman's voice rang out clear and strong from behind the massive pine. "Tom Sullivan, you old goat, still trying to scare away my new residents with talk of bears and blizzards?" Catherine Mackenzie emerged from the tree line like she owned the entire wilderness, tall and sturdy, with iron gray hair braided down her back and boots that had clearly seen their share of mud and mountains. She looked like the kind of woman who could stare down a charging buffalo and ask what took it so long to get there. "You must be Miss Whitley and Mr. Thornfield," she said, extending a work-calloused hand to each of them in turn. "I got your letter about teaching our children and helping with the livestock. Have to say, I was curious about a schoolmarm and a cowboy traveling together, but your references from that preacher in Cheyenne spoke well of your character." Constance felt heat rise in her cheeks. They had crafted their story carefully during the long journey north, presenting themselves as business partners rather than the something more they were becoming. The deception felt necessary but uncomfortable. "We appreciate the opportunity, Mrs. Mackenzie," Ezra said, his deep voice respectful but not subservient. "I know we must seem like an unusual pair." Catherine's sharp blue eyes studied them both with the intensity of someone who had spent years reading people's true intentions. "Unusual ain't bad, Mr. Thornfield. Usual is what we left behind when we came to this territory. What matters here is whether you can work hard, treat people fair, and help build something worth keeping." She gestured toward the settlement spread across the valley below. "New Haven's got 43 souls right now, counting the babies. We got a sawmill, a general store that's more hope than inventory, and the beginning of what might someday be a proper church. What we don't got is enough people who know how to read and write, or someone who understands cattle well enough to keep our herd healthy through winter." As they walked down the hillside toward the cluster of buildings, Catherine continued her informal tour. "That's the Kowalski family from Poland. Jan's the best carpenter this side of the Mississippi, and his wife Anna makes bread that could bring angels down from heaven. The tall fellow by the blacksmith shop is Samuel Freeman. Hat came here from Virginia after the war, looking for a place where a man's worth isn't measured by the color of his skin." Ezra noticed how naturally she spoke of differences as strengths rather than problems. In Cedar Ridge, his size had been an obstacle to overcome. Here, it seemed to be viewed as an asset. "Your letter mentioned you work with injured animals," Catherine said to Ezra. "That true?" "Yes, ma'am. Nothing fancy. Just basic healing and care. Basics more than we got now. Lost 2 calves last month to something I couldn't figure out. Would appreciate someone with your knowledge taking a look at the herd." They reached the settlement's main street, really just a wide dirt path between buildings. As the morning bustle began in earnest, children ran between houses carrying messages and chasing chickens. Women hung laundry on lines stretched between fence posts. Men worked on a half-finished barn that would serve as both community meeting hall and dance floor once completed. "Mrs. Mackenzie," called a young woman with flour-dusted hands and worried eyes, "could you come look at little Michael? He's been coughing something fierce since yesterday." "Course, dear. Miss Whitley, would you mind coming along? You mentioned in your letter that you had some training in caring for sick children." As they walked toward the small cabin where the sick child waited, Constance felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Philadelphia. The sense of being genuinely needed, rather than merely tolerated. Inside the one-room home, 3-year-old Michael Kowalski lay listless in his mother's arms, his breathing shallow and labored. His parents, Jan and Anna, looked up with desperate hope as the women entered. "Please," Anna whispered in heavily accented English. "He cannot breathe good. We try everything." Constance knelt beside the makeshift bed and gently examined the child. His fever was high, and she could hear the telltale rattle in his chest that spoke of fluid in his lungs. "Has he been around any animals recently?" she asked. "Particularly chickens or other birds?" Jan nodded quickly. "Yes, yesterday he play by chicken coop, fall in mud, get very dirty. I think he might have breathed in something that's irritating his lungs," Constance said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Back in Philadelphia, I helped care for my landlord's children when they had similar symptoms. We need to create steam to help him breathe easier and give him plenty of fluids." Working together, the women set up a makeshift steam tent using blankets and a pot of boiling water infused with pine needles. Within an hour, Michael's breathing began to ease, and by evening, his fever had broken. "You saved my boy," Anna said through tears of gratitude, pressing a loaf of fresh bread into Constance's hands. "How can we thank you?" "By letting me teach your children to read," Constance replied. "Knowledge is the best gift we can give the next generation." Meanwhile, Ezra had spent the day with the settlement's small herd of cattle, quickly identifying the problem that had been killing the calves. A contaminated water source near their grazing area had been making the animals sick. His solution was simple but effective: dig a new well uphill from the contamination and fence off the dangerous area. "You've got good instincts," Samuel Freeman observed as they worked together to move the fence posts. "Most folks would have just assumed it was bad luck and kept losing animals." "Animals can't tell you what's wrong," Ezra replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You got to learn to read the signs they can show you." Samuel paused in his digging and studied Ezra's face. "You know, I left Virginia because I got tired of people seeing my skin before they saw my skills. Something tells me you understand what that feels like." The two men worked in comfortable silence after that, united by the shared experience of being judged by appearances rather than actions. That evening, the entire settlement gathered for their weekly communal dinner. Long tables made from sawhorses and wooden planks filled the space between buildings. Lanterns hung from tree branches cast dancing shadows over faces that glowed with the satisfaction of hard work and shared purpose. Catherine Mackenzie stood and raised her tin cup of coffee. "Friends, we got ourselves some new members today. Miss Whitley saved young Michael's life and agreed to start teaching our children proper reading and writing. Mr. Thornfield figured out why we were losing cattle and already fixed the problem. I'd say New Haven just got a whole lot stronger." The cheer that went up from the gathered settlers was genuine and warm. Children ran up to tug on Constance's skirts, eager to know when school would start. Men clapped Ezra on the back and asked his opinion on various livestock issues. For the first time in either of their lives, they felt like they truly belonged somewhere. Later, as the celebration wound down and people drifted toward their homes, Ezra and Constance found themselves alone beside the small creek that ran through the settlement's heart. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, painted with more stars than seemed possible. "I never imagined it could be like this," Constance said softly. "A place where people value what you can do rather than worry about what makes you different." Ezra nodded, still hardly believing their good fortune. "Catherine offered me a partnership in expanding the cattle operation. Says the territory needs more people who understand both animals and land management. And Samuel's wife asked me to help plan a proper school building," Constance added. "They want their children to have every advantage, even out here in the wilderness." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the creek flow past on its journey to join larger waters somewhere downstream. Both understood they had found something rare and precious, a place where they could build a life based on their strengths rather than in spite of their differences. "Constance," Ezra said quietly, his deep voice barely audible above the water's gentle murmuring, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said back in Wyoming but was too scared to put into words." She turned to face him, her heart suddenly racing with anticipation and hope. "I love you," he continued, the words coming easier now that he'd finally spoken them aloud. "Not because you were kind to me when others weren't, though you were. Not because you saw past my size to who I really am, though you did. I love you because you're brave and smart and fierce, and because when I'm with you, I feel like the man I was always meant to be." Constance reached up to touch his face, her small hand gentle against his weathered cheek. "Oh, Ezra, I love you too. I think I have since that first day by the creek when I saw you caring for that injured sparrow." When he kissed her, it was with all the careful tenderness he'd once reserved for wounded creatures. But now there was something more: confidence, hope, and the deep contentment of a man who had finally found his place in the world. Around them, New Haven slept peacefully under the vast Montana sky. A settlement built by people brave enough to create their own version of home. And in that place where differences were celebrated rather than condemned, a gentle giant and a determined teacher began planning a future as wide and full of promise as the territory itself. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the continuing work of building something lasting from hope and determination. But tonight, under the endless canopy of stars, they had everything they needed: each other, a community that valued their contributions, and the knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin when you have the courage to write your own ending.